I'm here to present a paper titled Long-Term Monitoring and Analysis of Solar Water Heating System Performance in South Africa. This was, I'm just more or less a co-author. It's a paper that was developed by two other authors, which are more or less Professor Dimchev and Professor Dunef. But I happen to manage them because I'm the director of the center. So information still comes back to me. Having said that, I'm all the way from South Africa, which is more or less at the end of Africa. If you look at it from the southern part region side. And it's more or less a place where you have different kinds of climatic conditions, because we talk about the hot temperate, we talk about the arid temperate, we talk about the tropical coastals, and we also talk about the subtropical coastals. So you have different kinds of environment out there. And apart from that, also we do also have the normal snow that you do have, which is quite unlike what you see in other African countries out there. So it's more or less very close to the sea, very close to the inner region, the arid region, and things like that. So that's what South Africa is all about. I come from an institution that is more or less 50,000 intake every year. So that's how big my institution is. But in our institution, it's not only just about teaching and research. We also have to look for work in order to sustain our institutions. So my center is more or less a center that is more or less sustained by looking out for projects and also contributing to the industry. Having said that, I would like to just go down to the presentation itself. My presentation entails just what's the aim, the background, the monitored geographical locations, the equipment used, the methodology for determination of the energy savings from the solar water heating system, reporting and analysis of the results. Apart from that, what did we learn from such an exercise? And also in terms of the conclusion, which is very, very important. Just to give you an insight, the government is so much interested in solar water heating system because they believe so much in the contribution of it in terms of hot water usage and also in terms of ensuring that our utility is able to more or less sustain the demand. Having said that, the government in 2009, did bring out a program, and the program was more or less to roll out nothing less than 1 million solar water heating systems, which we were able to accomplish over a period in time. Having said that, also it's more or less trying to sustain it, looking for a situation where about 1 square meter of a solar thermal collector is more or less allocated to every individual within the population to the year 2030. So that's how far we're more or less looking at the issue around solar water heating systems. And we do believe so much in this. But having said that, this was more or less in terms of looking at the issue around the savings, because we've seen a lot of publications around savings, a lot of people saying one thing or the other. Now, more or less in terms of verification exercise, more or less to ensure that the actual is what is really reported. And also in terms of also checking at the background in terms of the target that are more or less initiated by the government. And in terms of that, the aim was more or less to look at about 100 systems, which are more or less basic 50 electric water heaters, another 50 high and low pressure solar water systems, performance in all the 6 climatic zones of South Africa. In South Africa, more or less 9 provinces, and in that 9 provinces, we do have different climate, and I'm sure most individuals are so much interested in Cape Town. And if you go to Cape Town, you'll find out that the climate changes every now and then. Don't be so sure today it's raining, tomorrow it's going to be turning, the next tomorrow is so it has a climate condition that you're not sure of what it is, even though you make a prediction. Or you'll be so much surprised that when you get there in the morning, it's another thing entirely. So that the impact of our climatic condition, especially around quantifications of energy savings, hence that was the whole overall, in order for us to analyze in terms of proper quantification of such system for realistic savings targets. Just to give a brief background, The project was more or less managed and funded by the South African Department of Energy, which is more or less the Department of Energy, DOE, and the Secretariat of the South African-German Energy Partnership. The German partnerships have been there, which is more or less the GIZ. They are more or less being in South Africa, and they partner us in terms of renewable energy issues. And I think they've done a lot. Apart from that, they are also into the wind technology side of things also. So in terms of that, they did fund it with the South African department in order for us to look at the actual savings. However, having said that, GIZ now appointed at my university to conduct a monitoring exercise of about 100 water heating systems, which is more or less just like I've highlighted, electrical, solar, and also kettle heating method throughout South Africa, based on the RSA climatic zone as per South African standard, and the method of water heating, and also in terms of numbers of occupants in their household dwellings with respect to hot water usage. In terms of it, we are more or less looking at the different kinds of incomes, but we really centered our mind around the low-income earners and as well as the middle income and high income earners. And in terms of it, meaning that in the low-income earners, you'll be looking at systems without backup, which are more or less passive systems, and also looking at the middle-income earners, which also have electric backups within their systems also. And if you look at the word there, there's kettle heating, because generally in the low-income dwelling, you find a lot of water heating taking place with kettles. So in terms of that, we have to look at it also in terms of looking at how much electric is being used for water heating within those income group. Having said that, this is more or less where the location of the monitoring installations were around the country. As you can see, we are more or less at the end, and that's where we are. We have different, very close to also countries like Swaziland, Mozambique, and also Lesotho, and as well as Namibia. That's why you have the WEEC level there. So that's where we are. However, we still have a country within our country itself, which is more or less Lesotho. So that's how big South Africa is in terms of its size. We are more or less about 55 millions in terms of numbers. Hence, that's the location, if you look, pointed out for you in order for you to have an insight into our monitoring exercise. In terms of exercise, just to give you an insight, those are more or less areas showing the different interlands that we really went into. Having said that, just also moving down, we have the South African climatic zone, just like I've highlighted, which is more or less in terms of cold interiors, the temperature interior, the hot interior, as well as the temperature for the coastal, which is more or less, and also the subtropical coastal, and as well as the arid areas. This is a measurement-based study and as well as a simulative study. The monitoring equipment were more or less supplied by the Real-Time Energy Limited in terms of telemetry systems. They measure more or less in uninterrupted inputs on the high-low pressure solar water system and report data back to a central base. Ours more or less is for us to look at the central base, download it, and more or less look at the behaviors of the system in terms of usage and also without usage. Like I said, it was more or less monitored, and in terms of the monitored system, we more or less make use of the GMS model. And we also give them the specification that we are more or less interested in. Having said that, our methodology was more or less to look at the energy that has never been used. That was where more or less we looked at. The standard, our process approach was, our methodology was based on the South African standard, which is more or less, we have a sort of standard out there, which is more or less coined from the MRV standard also. We call it the 50,010-2011 standard. And we are more or less, this is a national framework that we work with. There is always a regulation out there and a standard. Everything that comes in, even if it comes from the Europe areas, we're trying as much as possible to look at our environment in order to interpret it. Hence, we were more or less able to develop the MRB strategy, which we call the 50,010-2011. Having said that, In terms of our process, we are more or less looking at energy savings, which is termed as the energy that has never been used when solar water were introduced to the particular household, region, and to all region as a whole. Going further, just to look at it, we are more or less looking at the measured and the calculated parameters. Our instance more or less focus around one, looking at the solar water, looking at the electrical water consumption, and also looking at the cold water. Like I said, it was more or less based on measured and also as calculated. And in terms of our findings, our more or less centered around the hot water that was more or less delivered. When we talk about the delivered, we are more or less looking at the issue around the usage, because it's what the grid see that we term as the baseline. What the grid does not see, we can't term it as the baseline. We are more or less not looking at the issue in terms of just saying the solar water system is going to produce so amount of water, and that's going to be the expectation. We are looking at a situation where we have to look at it from what is being used, which is more or less the fundamentals that is more or less applicable with reference to when we were not using solar water into the system, we were more or less using that electrical. And hence, you more or less look at it from that point. If you look at what we have there, we have the incoming solar energy, we have the ambient temperature that was taken, we have the incoming cold water, which was really measured, and also we're looking at the electrical energy for the backup system, especially on the high pressure water system as a whole, which is very important to us. Then we had the hot water being measured in terms of how much is being produced with reference to the heat that is more or less being produced with reference to heat. We also looked at the losses that are more or less associated. Definitely during a period, there's always losses within the heat itself. So we looked at our issue, and we are also able to look at in terms of what is the solar fraction with reference to, in terms of using the solar water system and also in the electrical fractions. Hence, you've been able to see out there that we have the delivered measured hot water, which was more or less in terms of the hot water that was being delivered. Having said that, look at what we said. We said in terms of the heat energy, I need to move fast. Yeah, thanks, time. So in terms of that, we are more or less looking at, and we looked at it in terms of it with reference to the energy efficiency, which is more or less in terms of the energy conversion. Moving further, this is just more or less in terms of what we had in mind, electrical energy used, and more or less in terms of the energy of hot water used, which I just said earlier on, the solar fraction, which is more or less the savings that we're more or less interested. Now, moving down to the next side, in terms of it, we had a baseline, which is more or less looking at the electrical water heater, which is more or less what you have there. Then also looking at the low pressure system in terms of integrating it, because in the low income houses, the issue there was more or less to put the low pressure system with reference to the kettle method, which they more or less were applying there, and also those that had electric water heater also at their homes. At the high pressure type, we had a combination of both in terms of the solar water system, that is the solar system, and as well as the electrical backup system. In terms of our results, which was a great findings to us, we more or less looked at the energy hot water usage per household, which was our baseline in terms of the electrical power output, and that's the figure there. We have 237.83. Then the total energy used as hot water, because definitely, like I did say earlier on, we are more or less looking at the issue around the water that was used, and also looking at the losses that are more or less associated with it. Hence, in terms of the electrical fraction, we also looked at it from that point also, which is more or less the total energy being used at 11.79, but in terms of the usage, it was only 7.95. This just basically just to show you the average daily water and energy related events in terms of the consumption patterns, and also looking at it from the electrical water heater with reference to the different months. And in terms of the low pressure system also, we looked at it, both the average daily hot water usage. We also looked at it in terms of energy more or less being used, was the solar fraction. If you look at the solar fraction, it corresponds with the total, because definitely we replaced it and we had to take it out. So in terms of the emission factors, it's more or less with reference to 0.99, which in terms of kilogram with every kilowatt hours being used. Furthermore, also in terms of the different climatic zone, we have to look at the average performance for each of the low power low pressure water system, which is more or less designated. You can see that they differ from each other. That shows what the usage pattern and as well as the climatic conditions. If you look at the average irridances, it also differs from each area to the other. More or less in terms of our simulated aspect, which is more or less what we read as the intended, and also in terms of the actual, were more or less compared in terms of both the irridances and also in terms of the performance level. These are more or less graphical representation of what we had there in terms of the daily hot water usage and also in terms of users delivered energy. Then we did a sort of comparison also, which I've just highlighted in the tables also previously. Now going further, we also looked at the electrical pressure solar water system, which was more or less in terms of how much usage is being used. Please note that in terms of the liters, each of those, the low pressure heaters were more or less 150 liters, while the high pressure heaters were more or less 200 liters per. So just to give you a clarification on that. Having said that, this was more or less in terms of the low, high pressure solar water heaters, and in terms of it, more or less these are deductions that we more or less gotten from. And we looked at a particular time, which was more or less from 7 o'clock also to 17 hours in order for us to have a good insight into the performance of the solar water systems. Graphically, this more or less to depict it, it was more or less done in terms of average daily hot water usage, also high pressure daily average performance, and also the electrical and solar system, as well as the full solar fractions and hot water usage per each climatic zone. These are basically also just to reflect on all the usage patterns in order for you to have an insight, and also in terms of the simulated and also in terms of the comparison. Because my time is made, I'm trying to make sure I go faster. I mean, more or less, we did a lot of study in terms of the analysis, did the comparison studies in terms of the actual, which is more or less the measured, and also in terms of the intended solar fractions. This, based on the analysis, these were more or less the lessons that we have learned from the exercise, which is more or less, which includes changing of water usage habits, the avoiding usage of hot water by domestics during their day works. If you look at, I did talk about the middle income earners and as well as the high income earners. One thing is that you cannot do without the domestic being out there in the house taking care of issues. But in terms of their usages, it was an issue itself, because once the boss is not around, what do? You do what you want to do. So these things were more or less not quantified, and we found that a lot. Then we more or less did a study in order for us to look at the issue around, okay, let's do a sort of control management, that is in terms of the education of the domestic to use it, and also without the domestic having such an education. And if you can see, there is more or less a difference between the two graphical I exposed, which shows that there is a lot that more or less can be done. Also, we looked at the issue around people more or less disconnecting their backup element during the day and time. We also looked at the issue around the backup element coming as a usage of the domestic, also more or less using those waters and all that, and the contributions. In conclusions, looking at the basic installations, many medium and low income houses installations show this tendency that all normal switch on their electric water heaters only when needed. Water heating was done in the peak hours, thus contributing to the high load, which led to the resumption of load shedding. This is an issue because we found out that those, especially the medium and houses, whenever they have such an installation, what they do is that whenever they need water, which is more or less during the peak hours, because they have to go to their office, and when they return back to their office, that's when they tend to switch on their elements, and which was not good also for our grid system, because there's always a lot of comeback loads, which was so much on the system as a whole. And also in terms of the baseline measurement, it was used for developing of hot water profile. However, this profile is expected to change when the electrical water heaters are replaced with the solar water system as a result of hot water availability during the day. The baseline hot water usages are different from the typical solar water heating usage profile. This is because the hot water usage change their habit due to the availability of hot water during the day. Another finding that we found out was that immediately you install the solar water system, people now to change their habits. And this also contributed. We were more or less looking at the savings, which government was also more or less looking at. But they found out that, no, we do have it. Why not utilize it? It's not costing us anything. And they never forget that we were more or less looking at the issues around peak loads within the environment as a whole. Also, in general, the high pressure systems were more or less what supplied with timers for peak hours. Hence, what the electrical backup, according to the utility, what they did was that they can easily switch you on and off. So switching off and interrupting the operational cycle also more or less was an issue, especially with reference to the usage. Instead of that, some homeowners had a sort of bypassing it, even though the utility, they all got the electricians to bypass it, and they used it according to what they want. So this was finding also. So it was more negatively also impacting on the grid system. So these are more or less issues that we were able to more or less get from our findings. Like we said, the presence of the domestic workers was another issue entirely, and also in terms of the discontinuation of the backup power system. But one of our findings, which was very paramount, that in terms of the overall solar fraction, we found out that it was only 20% that was contributing from the high pressure system, which was more or less a negative impact on what the government really expected from it, because they were more or less looking at a situation where the solar was more or less going to impact, but we found out that it was only 27% of the impact that was gotten from. Then another thing was more or less in terms of improper orientation of the solar water systems. Even though they had people out there, most of them could not install it properly because they just had it in mind that, okay, just place it towards the north and things like that without taking the orientation into consideration. And also in terms of the regulations that more or less, which is under the standard 10,106, 2008, in terms of installation purposes. And also in terms of setting the setting point, people were more or less setting their setting point much more above what was more or less in terms of being able to take care of the bacteria that are also associated with the system itself. However, we did also notice that individuals were more or less able to also control their systems, which was very good. But in terms of it also, we expect that there should be a lot of education also in terms of the usage of hot water. Another issue was more or less in terms of the shower. People were more or less in terms of wastage. But the greatest finding in terms of it was that we were able to realize that the target that was set by the government and by Department of Energy in terms of realization was more or less 17.7 kilowatt per day for the high pressure system. But in terms of our study, we discovered that it was only 2.27, which was basically a lot. This, more or less, is to correct their expectations, because at the end of the day, they were more or less looking at it from a deterministic point of view and assumptions. And we were more or less able to show that the system was more or less not contributing what they expect. So we believe that the plant, there's going to be a planned adjustment in terms of the findings. But in terms of the solar water system, also, there were issues. One of the issues was supply of water, because affordability is another issue. Water is not given, you have to pay for it. And these were issues that we also find out, and which are also impacted in terms of the usage of the solar water heating system. However, in terms of the government rollout target, which was more or less 1.5 kilowatt hours, our findings shows that you were more or less able to achieve 1.63 kilowatt hours per day, which was more or less a very good target in terms of their choice. In general, the study showed that the majority of the that is the high pressure system solar water are under designed for the average hot water usage profile in the country. In order to fully to use fully the excellent solar potential of South Africa, larger system with higher storage capacity, that is in terms of 300 liters and higher, are needed. In addition, awareness and simple hot water usage management are very, very necessary. We believe that if you educate, definitely you get a lot from savings. And I think this is one of the high points of our studies, that people that had the knowledge of how to use it were more or less able to save a lot of water. Thank you.